Episode 8: The Oxygen Revolution. Take a deep breath. Feel the air filling your lungs, oxygen flowing into your bloodstream, carried to every cell in your body. This oxygen will combine with sugars in your cells, releasing energy in a controlled burn that powers your every thought, every heartbeat, every movement. You do this automatically 20,000 times a day without thinking about it. But this simple act, breathing oxygen, would have been impossible for most of Earth's history. For the first 2 billion years after life began, there was essentially no free oxygen in the atmosphere. The air was a mixture of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, and other gases. The air was a mixture of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, and other gases. But oxygen was absent or present only in trace amounts. And this was not an accident. Oxygen is a highly reactive gas. It combines readily with other elements, oxidizing them, rusting them, burning them. In the early Earth, any oxygen that was produced quickly reacted with reduced substances in the ocean and atmosphere, iron and sulfur and methane, and was consumed before it could accumulate. But around 2.4 billion years ago, something extraordinary happened. Oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere. Within a geologically short period, perhaps just a few million years ago, the composition of Earth's atmosphere changed fundamentally. This event, called the Great Oxidation Event, was one of the most significant transformations in our planet's history. It was also one of the greatest catastrophes ever to befall life on Earth. For the most of organisms at this time, oxygen was a poison. It damaged their cellular machinery, broke down their proteins, destroyed their DNA. The rise of oxygen caused a mass extinction, wiping out huge numbers of species that had thrived in the oxygen-free world of the Archean. And yet, from this catastrophe, new possibilities emerged. Oxygen, despite its toxicity, is also an incredibly useful molecule. It allows for far more efficient metabolism, releasing much more energy from food than anaerobic processes can. The rise of oxygen made complex life possible, paving the way for everything that would follow. Animals, plants, fungi, the entire visible biosphere. This is the story of the oxygen revolution, of how a waste product from photosynthetic bacteria transformed the planet and changed the course of evolution forever. To understand the great oxidation event, we need understand where oxygen came from and why it suddenly began to accumulate after hundreds of millions of years of being consumed as fast as it was produced. As we discussed in the previous episode, cyanobacteria evolved oxygenic photosynthesis perhaps 3 billion years ago or even earlier. These bacteria used light energy to split water molecules using the hydrogen to build organic compounds and releasing oxygen as a waste product. For hundreds of millions of years, this oxygen didn't accumulate. The ocean was full of reduced iron, dissolved in the water as ferrous iron. When oxygen produced by cyanobacteria encountered this iron, it oxidized it to ferric iron, which is insoluble and precipitated out of the water, sinking to the seafloor as rust-colored sediment. This process created the banded iron formations we discussed earlier. Vast deposits of iron oxide layered with silica, one of the largest iron ore deposits on Earth. These formations are a record of oxygen production in the ancient ocean, the rust of a world that was slowly being oxidized. But iron isn't infinite, and as cyanobacteria continued to produce oxygen century after century, millennium after millennium, the ocean slowly ran out of reduced iron to soak it up. Other reduced substances in the ocean, sulfur compounds and organic matter, were also oxidized and depleted. Finally, around 2.4 billion years ago, the ocean became saturated with oxygen. There were no more reduced substances available to consume it. And when that also happened, the oxygen began to escape in the atmosphere. This is a great oxidation event. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere rose from nearly zero to perhaps 1% of modern levels, and possibly higher within a few million years. This might not sound like much, but it was a revelation. The chemistry of the atmosphere changed fundamentally, and the consequences were profound. First, let us consider what happened to the organisms that had evolved in the oxygen-free world. Bacteria and archaea continued to thrive, and they are still there today, living in the same oxygen-free environments their ancestors inhabited billions of years ago. Other organisms adopted the evolved defenses against oxygen toxicity, enzymes to neutralize free radicals, repair mechanisms to fix damage. Some of these animals became facultative anaerobes, capable of living with or without oxygen, switching their metabolism depending on what was available. And some organisms went further. They evolved the ability to use oxygen in their metabolism to harness its reactivity for their own purpose. This was the origin of aerobic respiration, one of the most important metabolic innovations in the history of life. Aerobic respiration is the process by which organisms use oxygen to break down organic molecules, extracting far more energy than is possible through anaerobic processes. When you burn sugar and oxygen, you release about 20 times more energy than when you ferment sugar without oxygen. This is why aerobic organisms can be so much larger and more active than anaerobic ones. They have access to much richer energy source. The evolution of aerobic respiration was not immediate. It probably took millions of years for bacteria to evolve the complex enzymatic machinery needed to use oxygen safely and efficiently. But once it evolved, it was extraordinarily successful. Aerobic bacteria spread across the oxygenated parts of the ocean, outcompeting their anaerobic cousins in environments where oxygen was available. But the Great Oxidation Event didn't just affect life directly, it also changed the planet in ways that had profound indirect effects on life. One of the most important changes was the formation of the ozone layer. Ozone is a molecule made of 3 oxygen atoms, and it forms in the upper atmosphere when ultraviolet light from the sun strikes oxygen molecules. Ozone absorbs ultraviolet radiation, preventing it from reaching the surface. Before the Great Oxidation Event, there was no ozone layer. The surface of the Earth was bathed in UV radiation that would be lethal to most modern organisms. This radiation was one of the major constraints on early life, limiting where organisms could live and requiring them to evolve protective mechanisms. But once oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere, ozone layer began to form. Within a few million years, it was formed, a shield that blocked most of the harmful UV radiation from reaching the surface. This made the surface ocean and eventually the land much more hospitable to life. Another consequence of the rise of the oxygen was a change in climate. Before the Great Oxidation Event, the atmosphere contained significant amounts of methane produced by methanogenic archaea. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, and it may have helped keep Earth warm in the Archean, compensating for the fact that the sun was dimmer than that is now. But methane is unstable in the presence of oxygen. When oxygen levels rose, the methane in the atmosphere was oxidized to greenhouse effect weakened and the Earth started cooling. How much it cooled is still debated, but some evidence suggests that Earth may have experienced its first ice age around the time of the Great Oxidation Event. Glacial deposits from this period, around 2.4 to 2.2 million years ago, are found on continents that were near the equator at the time, suggesting that the ice extended to low latitudes. This ice age, called the Huronian glaciation, may have been one of the first snowball Earth events, periods when ice covered much or all of the planet. We will discuss snowball Earth events in more detail in a future episode. For now, it is enough to note that the rise of oxygen may have triggered a dramatic climate change, plunging Earth into a deep freeze. But Earth didn't remain frozen forever. This ice age eventually ended, probably because volcanic activity continued to add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, strengthening the greenhouse effect until temperatures rose enough to melt the ice, and life, which had survived in refuges during the freeze, spread and diversified once the ice retreated. The Great Oxidation Event also changed the chemistry of the ocean in other ways. With oxygen present, many elements that had been soluble in the reduced ocean became insoluble in the oxidized ocean, and vice versa. The availability of nutrients changed, affecting which organisms could thrive and where. For example, iron, which had been abundant in the Archean Ocean, was now mostly oxidized and precipitated, making it scarce. This may have limited the growth of some organisms that relied on iron for their metabolism. On the other hand, other elements like sulfate became more abundant, creating new ecological niches. The ocean also became stratified by oxygen content. The surface waters in contact with the oxygenated atmosphere became aerobic, but the deep ocean remained largely anaerobic, with little or no oxygen, a situation that persisted for hundreds of millions of years. This created two distinct worlds. Within the ocean, the oxygenated surface, where aerobic organisms thrived and photosynthesis powered the ecosystem, and the anoxic depths, where anaerobic organisms continued to live as they had much as they had in the Archean. Between those two zones was a chemocline, a boundary layer where oxygen levels changed rapidly. The This boundary was probably a region of intense biological activity, with organisms adapted to exploit the chemical gradients. The Great Oxidation Event wasn't a single instantaneous change. It was a complex process that played out over tens of or hundreds of millions of years, with oxygen levels fluctuating, rising and falling as the balance between oxygen production and consumption shifted. After the initial rise of around 2.4 billion years ago, oxygen levels may have stabilized at relatively low levels, perhaps 1 to 10% of modern values, for more than a billion years. This period, sometimes called the boring billion, which we'll discuss in more detail in episode 10, was a time of relative environmental stability, with oxygen present but not abundant. It wasn't until much later, around 800 to 500 million years ago, that oxygen levels rose again, approaching and eventually exceeding modern levels. This synchronized oxygen, often sometimes called as Neoproterozoic oxygenation event, was crucial for the evolution of animals and other complex lives. But that is a story for a future episode. For now, let us focus on the immediate aftermath of the Great Oxidation Event, on the world that emerged from this transition. By 2 billion years ago, the Earth had changed profoundly from the Archean world that preceded it. The atmosphere now contained oxygen, and an ozone layer protected the surface from UV radiation. The ocean was partially oxygenated, with aerobic organisms dominating the surface waters. The climate had cooled, and the ice ages had come and gone. Life had adapted. Aerobic respiration had evolved, allowing organisms to extract far more energy from food. Defenses against oxygen toxicity had developed, and in the oxygen-free depths and sediments, anaerobic life continued, largely unchanged from its Archean ancestors. This was Proterozoic Eon, the age of early life, a period that would last for more than 1.5 billion years. From 2.5 billion years ago to 540 million years ago. For much of this time, life remained single-celled, dominated by bacteria and archaea, with only the simplest eukaryotic cells beginning to appear. But this stage was set for greater complexity. The rise of oxygen had created new opportunities, new ecological niches, new ways for organisms to make a living, and evolution, given time and opportunity, is endlessly creative. As we close this episode, let us reflect on the paradox of oxygen. It is essential for life as we know it, the basis of our metabolism, the, the molecule that powers our cells. We cannot live without it, and yet for most of the Earth's history it was absent. And when it first appeared, it was a poison, a pollutant that killed vast numbers of organisms. This is a recurring theme in the Earth's history. One organism's waste product is another's resource. One species' catastrophe is another's opportunity. The cyanobacteria that produced oxygen as a waste product had no use for it. They were polluting their environment as much as we pollute ours today with carbon dioxide and other waste products. But this pollution, this oxygen, transformed the planet and made new forms of life possible. Without it, there would be no animals, no plants, no fungi, no complex life of any kind. We exist because of a pollution event that occurred 2.4 billion years ago. This should give us a pause. The changes we are making to our planet now, the carbon dioxide we are adding to our atmosphere, the climate we are changing, may seem catastrophic from our perspective, and they are for many species, including potentially our own, but in the long view of geological time, they are just another transition, another change in the ever-evolving story of Earth. Life will adapt. It always has. New species will evolve to fill the niches left vacant by extinctions. The planet will continue unchanged but persistent. This is not to minimize the tragedy of extinction or the moral imperative to preserve the diversity and beauty of life as it exists today. But it is to recognize that Earth is resilient, that life is resilient, that change is only constant. The Great Oxidation Event reminds us of this. It was a catastrophe and a revolution, a mass extinction and a new beginning, all at once. It reshaped the planet and redirected the course of evolution, and it was caused by life itself, by the metabolic activity of countless trillions of bacteria over hundreds of millions of years. We are not the first species to change the world. We are not even the most significant. The cyanobacteria transformed Earth far more profoundly than we have, at least so far. But we are the first species to do so knowingly, with awareness and intent. What we do with that knowledge, how we choose to shape it, and to shape our planet's future is the question of our time. The oxygen revolution offers no easy answers, but it reminds us that the Earth, we know it's not eternal, that it has changed before, and creativity and resilience will find a way to persist. In the next episode, we'll see what happened when Earth froze again, more severely than it had during the Huronian glaciation. We will witness snowball Earth, a period when ice may have covered the entire planet from pole to pole, and we will see how life survived beneath the ice, waiting for the thaw. The story continues, ever changing, ever surprising, as our planet spins through the cosmos, alive and evolving. And this is the end of this episode, as we learned that for the Great Oxidation event. So, I invite you to check my channel to see more and more stories that for sure will help you relaxing and falling asleep. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video. Bye.